Eulogy, Chapter 4. My father leaned his head forward to sip more scorched black coffee and let it fall back again onto the headrest of his easy chair. Dr. Milton says she could be in this condition for weeks, maybe longer. We stared in unison at the black, liquid gray window of the console television, the focus of the room's furniture, trying perhaps to peer into it, behind it, avoiding eye contact. That's no way to live. The cushions of my parents' couch sagged, and the frame cut into my thighs. My legs were numb. I crossed them under me. But can't he help you? He has his license to think about. I glanced at my father and accidentally met his eyes. They were as blank as the TV screen. There was an animal sense about them, weary of the past, fearful of the future. I had to look away. My mother had insisted that Nina and I spend an evening with the two of them before the wedding, a sort of family council. I had been living with Nina in New York, in sin, as it were, for nearly a year. My parents had managed to overcome their qualms. They pretended to accept our saving on ungodly high rent for 2 apartments argument, and overlooked this moral effrontery, though my mother had made it clear they did not like it, much less condone our decision. Nina had balked at the idea of any sort of pastoral counseling. We were bright, modern, aware adults. We knew what we wanted, knew what we were getting into. Religious issues were mere afterthoughts, quaint. But I owe them that much, I had said. After all, they are my parents. Though she sensed my ambivalence, she did not press her advantage. She acquiesced, and I loved her all the more for it. The two of us had huddled together on this same sofa. Even then, the stuffing and the cushions had begun to give. Nina, leafing through the thick scrapbook of snapshots, my mother had plopped onto her lap. There I was, mewling and stupid in a fat, loose cloth diaper with an ankle tag and an inky foot. There, in a series of Halloween costumes, a bunny suit with lopsided ears and a black eye of unknown origin, a black mask and fedora and Zorro cape with a plastic foil. A Frankenstein's monster menacing a group of teenage girls. There I was in a series of pointy paper hats, blowing out an increasing number of candles on various birthday cakes. There, in different sets of pajamas on numerous Christmas mornings, riding a hobby horse or playing with some forgotten mechanical toy. There I was standing with my father in front of our old Rambler station wagon, or the new Dodge in the graveled driveway of the parsonage in Falston Trace. There I was in a new spring suit, with my arm around Amy Bowen's shoulders after church one Easter. There, in the same suit, strutting across the stage as the lead in the high school play, long-haired and mustachioed. There, again in the same jacket, pounding a wooden podium as captain of the debating team. And there I was, gowned and tassel-capped, graduating from college. I suspect that for my mother this scrapbook was as much marketing tool as memento. I never knew her to be so rankly sentimental. But as Nina chuckled her way through the faded and browning pictures, I winced with the feeling that they were no more than an advertisement for my meager upbringing. Mother's eyes that evening reflected the gleam of the silver urn she had set out for us, alongside a napkin-lined plate of homemade brownies after dinner. It was the only time I could recall her using the silver service, which she reserved for special guests, for me. We had eaten of dry, baked chicken with wild rice, overboiled broccoli, and sugar-glazed carrots off her mother's bone china. She kept our crystal goblets sweating through the meal with sweet tea so cold it made my teeth ache. Still sporting her lap apron, even though our meals had been cleared away, she took the scrapbook from Nina, measured out our coffees, then sat down in the side chair she always sat in, the one with the blue toil print of a shotgun-toting hunter and his dogs jumping a brace of pheasants, smoothed the creases in her flared skirt and crossed her ankles. My father peered at Nina across the top of his coffee cup, arched an eyebrow over his horn-rimmed glasses, and said, "So, which of you is it going to be?" "Joseph Beaton," my mother said. She rarely used his first name, even in my presence, choosing to refer to him in the royal third person, Reverend Beaton. Now you behave. We just sat down to coffee. Give the kids a moment to get settled. Here, have a brownie. She thrust the plate at him. Nina worried a kidney pillow behind her back. A silent, coffin-sized console stereo took up half of the opposite wall in those days. Even then, though it had not worked in a dozen years, my parents refused to junk it. Instead, they used it as a television stand and an occasional sideboard. Nina, my father chose to ignore my mother's upbraiding. Why don't you tell me what you think? I'm sorry, she temporized. Which of the two of you do you feel should be the first to pass? She stared at him as she might a sales clerk who had just told her she had tapped out her credit card limit. With all due respect, Reverend Beaton, that's hardly a fair question. I know it's not a pleasant subject, but it's a serious one. I always ask it of the couples that want me to marry them, he said. He turned to me. What about you, Joshua? Any thoughts? Let's not do this tonight. I had suspected something like this might be coming, had told Nina to expect some sort of ambush, even though my father, much to my mother's chagrin, would not be performing our wedding. We've thought this through, son. My mother's words surprised me. And your father feels you should as well. Every couple who wants to get married should. Remember, the vow says, until death do you part. So, I looked at her. What did you two decide? A favored tactic of my youth that still served me well at my job, putting my inquisitors on the defensive. There is no one right answer, my father said. But as a matter of faith, there is one way of looking at it. Mary Helen and I discussed it at length, didn't we, dear, before our wedding? She nodded and smiled. More coffee? She leaned forward and laid her hand on the curving silver handle of the coffee pot, examining each of us and our cups in turn. Nina and I shook our heads. Another brownie, dear? She picked up the plate and handed it to my father. He took two. When we were engaged, we were much younger than the two of you at the time. We had this discussion with our pastor, Dr. Griggs. Remember him? He caught a crumb tumbling off his chin. Sure, didn't he have a farm out in the country? I milked my first cow there, picked my first bowl of cotton, earning money for gas and beer. Right, and I think it is fair to say we were just as surprised as the two of you by the question. He smiled at my mother. No, we had never thought about it, she said. Who does at that age? You think you're going to live forever. But Dr. Griggs gave us time to think about it. We talked about it practically every night for a month. Remember how we used to sit out on the porch, swing at your mother's house every evening after dinner? That's right, dear. And normally I would ask this question the first time a couple comes to see me, so they can think about it before the next session as a sort of spiritual exercise. But we don't have that luxury since y'all live in New York. He eyed Nina. But you're a bright couple, he smiled. What do you think? Nina filled her and my coffee cups, holding down the top of the pot, and wadded a paper napkin to mop up a small drop that had trickled onto the salver. She glanced at me as she dribbled in a few drops of half and half, her smile masking what I took from her eyes to be a certain imploring desperation. More cream, Jay? Thanks, just a tad. I took a sip. Coffee, cream, and air. Okay, so, Dad, what did you and Mom decide? He looked at me, then at my mother. Well, that's really between us, he said. I glanced back and forth from one of my parents to the other. They had no intention of letting up. This was going to be interminable. Mother nodded. You two need to resolve it for yourselves first.